this session I love doing because I can do it for 20 minutes or I can do it for 20 hours. We're going to I'm going to give you some tips and tricks that I've learned in developing over the last 20 days or 20 years, depending on how you look at it. We're going to go through a simple application. It has, we have a person class that has first name, middle initial, last name, email address, date of birth, children, and then there's this method that will convert the first name, last name, middle initial into a full name field. So I'm going to go through and debug some of the known bugs in this application. So if we look at it, this is using the new C# 9 syntax, so we don't have the sub main, even though it's visible, and we'll see that in a minute. So we're going to print out hello world and then kind of load a list of people and then navigate. But before we do that, I want to do one thing. I'm going to build the application, and I'm going to try my hardest to tell you every keyboard shortcut I use, but it's very different from person to person, machine to machine, because with Visual Studio, you can customize your keyboard shortcuts. So the reason why I built this screen is to show you one thing. Oops, that's not what I want to do. Let's rebuild it. Before we go into here, I switched it to 7. Let's go and do that. And make sure the product's on on .NET 6. Oh, great. Let's go and make sure this is on .NET 6. So I am going to edit the project file and change it to .NET 6. And then rebuild it. There it goes, that worked. And now I'm going to kind of go through and walk a little bit about what that means. So I'm going to open up this in File Explorer. So if you ever got into File Explorer, this is after I compiled the application. You're going to notice that there are 2 directories in there, bin folder and obj folder. Those get added as soon as you build a product. Now, you may be thinking, well, Visual Studio does that, blah, blah, blah. And actually, Visual Studio doesn't do it. There's a product underneath the scenes called MS Build or Microsoft Build that takes your source code and generates the IL that is used by .NET to execute the program. So here you see I have my C# project file, the mastering debugging, and then the 2 class files. If I go into the bin directory, you'll see I have 2 directories here, one called debug and one called release. These are called debug configurations. So you'll notice up in here, I have a DBU. It's because I have the fonts increased for the presentation. You can't see the full thing. If I clicked on here, you'll see I have a debug and release configuration. And what that does is those tell Visual Studio or MS Debug how I want to handle the actual code. So when you do a debug, now with later versions, I think this started in .NET 5, it creates a separate folder for each framework you're building against. In this case, I've only had it for .NET 6 and .NET 7. So if I go into this file, I'll see a couple of files in here. The one most of us are used to are the mastering debugging.exe. This is the actual executable that runs. But there's also some other files that I didn't generate, but MS Build generated for me. Mastering debugging, which is the actual code that runs. The mastering debugging is just a shell that will call out to this DLL. Then there's this hidden file called PDB, or Program Debug Database. So if you've been doing any Microsoft development for a while, you've probably run across an exception or the yellow screen of death in ASP.NET, now the light blue screen of death. Basically, that tells you, hey, there's an error, the application crashed, and here's a bunch of stuff. Visual Studio, or in that case, IIS, gets that from this PDB file. So inside the mastering debugging and the mastering debugging.dll, these are just the executable nodes. The PDB file ties the code that's running with the source code. You're probably saying to yourself, I don't want to distribute the source code with my app, and you don't. So that's why there's a debug and a release build. If you choose the release build and you have the right settings selected, the PDB file is not generated. But this is for you to be able to debug your app, as we'll see in a minute. So let's go and run this app. If I click this little button here, I'll get the ability to run it in debug mode. If I click this button here, I start it without debugging. The difference between the two is run generates that PDB file, and then Visual Studio, which is called the debugger in this particular case, attaches to that file. So it generates this PDB file and then puts this on top of it and says, I'm going to watch what you're doing so that I can explain it here. If I click on just this button, it's just going to run the application, and we'll see here that I get an error. So there's an error, system argument out of range exception, index was out of range, must be negative, blah, blah, blah. So let's figure out how to find that problem. So I'm going to hit enter to end it. Before we go and look into the problem, let's look at what our options are. So if we go on the debug menu, you'll see a lot of different options. So if we click on Windows, there's breakpoints, exception settings, output, etc. Breakpoints we'll talk about in a little bit. Exception settings we'll talk about towards the end. The output you kind of see right below. This menu will also change while we're actually debugging the application. Then when I talked about before, there's start debugging and start without debugging. So if I hit F5 on my machine, I'm going to start debugging, which is what most of us do, or click the solid green triangle. Some of these other items we're going to cover in a minute. So I'm just going to put a breakpoint here for now. So I can do that many different ways. I can click in what's called the gutter, and that's going to turn it red and put a breakpoint here. And the reason why I want to do that is to start the app in debugging and show you some of the other debugging menu items. So hit play. You notice this one took a little bit longer. The console app is going to start, and now a bunch of things are happening. So to the right, I get, and this could be left, could be the bottom of your machine, I get the diagnostic tool. So this is taking a look at the memory, events that are happening, how much CPU I'm using, and then because I have the Enterprise Edition of Visual Studio, I am seeing what's called IntelliTrace, which is a bunch of events and stuff. I'm not going to cover that. That's a whole talk all by itself. But if you look at my Visual Studio menu, a lot of things have changed. My debugging menu went a heck of a lot longer. Now it takes up the full screen. So let's take a look at it. If I look at Windows, the Windows added a whole bunch more. So again, I'm going to talk about breakpoints, exceptions a little bit later. Diagnostic tools, that's everything to the right. So that appeared automatically because I always have that there. If I was running Python, I would see this. GPU threads, this is used if you have a lot of, if you're using graphics processor, you can see all the threads. If you're using the parallel task library, these three windows will show the tasks or the different threads that you're running. We're going to focus on the watch, autos, local, and immediate in a couple of minutes. These are if you're using XAML or HTML. The live visual tree will show you all the different elements and how they relate to each other for Chrome or Edge, and these will show you for XAML. Call stack we'll look at in a little bit. The threads, modules, and IntelliSense events are for multi-threaded and a little bit more advanced situations. The rest are if you're really hardcore developer and want to look at the memory being used, manage memory, disassembly. So let's take a look at the others. I can hit F5 to continue the app. I can stop it by doing Shift F5. I can detach all. Remember when I said when you start debugging, Visual Studio will kind of hook on to the application. The detach will keep the application running, but Visual Studio is no longer paying attention. Attach Unity, if you're building a game or something with the Unity engine, this is what that's for. Terminate all will stop all the applications that Visual Studio is attached to. Restart will do that. Hot reload or hot mess is the apply code changes depending on the type of project you're using. You may or may not be able to edit the code and apply it without restarting the application. We're not going to cover that because it's still a little hit or miss. These performance profiles are because I have a third-party tool in there. Attach Snapshot Debugger. This is a cool tool if you have your apps in Azure. You can attach the Snapshot Debugger to your Azure instance, whether it be a VM or an Azure IIS site. It'll look at that. So let's take a look at some of the step overs, and we're going to kind of cover these in a minute. So I see the hello world is going. I'm going to step over that. So let's go and click this F10. So step over means run that code. I'm good. So I'm going to go to the next line here by clicking the step over. And I see, okay, this is list of person. It's going to create a variable called people using this populate people method. If I'm new to the app, I'm going to be like, well, what's that? So I'm going to do something called step into. So I'm going to go inside of that method. So I click that, you see my mouse and my current line move to line 21. One thing I want to note, the colors that you see might be different. This is the color scheme I chose. I also changed the current statement to change to yellow for this presentation because it kind of accentuates the line of code we're on and makes it easy, but the default is just to kind of highlight it. So I see that's the method. I'm going to continue. Now I get this line of code that says it's going to create a new list of person and creates a person with the first name Joseph, James, Guadagno, email address, date of birth, number of children, etc. So I'm like, okay, that's good. I can then step out of the method or I can continue running. So if I choose step out, I'm going to go back out to the top and now I'm at this 6. So I'm like, okay, that's good. So let me just step over that, run that method. And if I look at the person class, I'll see that there's 4 people. So far that's good. I'm going to go step over, keep going. And I notice it generates a person. If I go back and look at it, it generated the first one. So we look here, we see it executed line 10. If I go again, it's going to execute that. Now, if I notice before, as you see here, it generated the second line. If I notice before, it generated 4 of them. And if I look at the class, I can see there's 4. So let me put a breakpoint here. And then I'm going to continue. So it's going to go and run all those up into that point. So if I look at the code, I'll see here it generated Joseph, Deirdre, my son Joseph, and my daughter Emily. Now, if I run this code, if you notice, it only generated 4 people. I'm accessing the 6. So this is where the bug is going to go. So I click run, I'm going to get an exception caught message. And I'll make that a little bit bigger so we can see. And it says index out of range must be negative, blah, blah, blah. And it says it was thrown in this call stack. Then I see a couple of options here. View details, copy details, start live section, and then 2 other things in the exception settings. So let's look at view details first. View details shows us something called a quick watch. Quick watch allows you to see different variables. So this is going to be a grid of the availables here. So right now there's this special character here, the American $, an exception. So this is going to show me a special variable. Because I'm in an exception mode, I want to see this. So it basically does a toString of everything. So the exception property has like 8 or 9 different properties. An actual value, a data, which is a list that I can look at and see a bunch of properties, and then an inner exception and a message. You also notice that there's this little view thing, which is called a visualizer. I can click on view and see it in a larger screen, which is really handy if there's a lot of text. Let's say you're returning HTML from a database or something, you want to see the whole thing. You can also change the type. So there's 4 built-in visualizers. There's an XML visualizer. If I'm returning XML, or this variable is here, it'll do the pretty printing of the XML, give you a tree that allows you to break it out and see the different pieces of it. Same thing with HTML and JSON. So I know this error is here. I can fix it. It's already fixed in the code. Another thing to do is you can tell Visual Studio, by default, it is going to break on the exception. Because I'm already in debugging and I turn this option off, it's not going to do it. If I click this, I can say it should always break on this exception, or say never break when this exception happens, because I want the code to be smart enough to handle it. There's also the exception settings, which are here. And let me zoom out of this a little bit. The exception settings allow you to go and override the exception settings. So here I can see everything that's solid means everything underneath there is going to happen. So this is going to break on any common language runtime exception, but I can turn those, or actually no, it's solid. If it was a check mark, it would be there. So if I choose here and say argument out of range exception, break on that. Otherwise, uncheck it and it'll never break. So you can control which ones break, which ones don't break. We're going to leave that for now. Let's go take a look at some of the other things. So let's stop this app for a second. Let's say I want to break on my daughter's record. My daughter, for those of you who have kids, know girls are always trouble. It's actually boys that are trouble for a while, then girls take over the reins, but to each his own. If you look at the person class, Emily is the 4th person in the list because she just happened to be the last. Imagine if this was a database and you were going back and forth and you had 1,000 records, and for some reason the 999th record was the one that was broken. There's the ability to do what's called a conditional breakpoint. So I'm going to do that right now. If I click on the record, you get these kind of little 2 options here. One is a little settings and one is a disable. So I'm going to click on the settings. Settings brings up this dialog box that allows me to set conditions, actions, remove once hit, or only enable when the following breakpoint is hit. And I'll cover that in a minute. So let's go and choose the condition. See if I can make this a little bit bigger. No, I can't. Let's see if I can shrink this if it follows along. Yep. So here you can break on any condition. So basically, it has to be true or once changed. So here I can do person dot first name. And you see I have IntelliSense here. And this has to be C# syntax because I'm using C#. And say Emily. So this is only going to break when the person first name is Emily. Now if I hit close, you notice here that this is now a plus instead of a red circle, and it shows me that there's a condition. So if I go back and hit play, I'm going to hit the first breakpoint. Let's put that to the side. Now, if I hit play again, it continued all the way and it stopped at Emily. So let's go and look to make sure that's the case. If we look here, it printed out the first person, which is me, second person, my wife, and the third person, which is my son, and stopped on Emily. So that's cool. That allows us to go and set conditions to there. There's a couple other things you can do with the breakpoints. I'm going to stop again for a second, come back here. Let's go back to the conditions, and I right-click to get that. There's other conditions I can add too, like the hit count. I can say only stop when this line was called 3 times. So this goes to that example. If I had 999 examples and it always failed on 998, I can change this. So I can say when the hit count is 3, meaning this line of code ran 3 times, break. There's also the filter, which is true. And now this is if you want to filter out certain threads. So if you're using a multi-threaded thing, only say if the thread number is 1, 2, 3, 4, break. There's also actions you can do. So here I can choose to continue code. So write out when Emily is there, and I can just put a message to Emily. So I'm going to use the keyword function that tells me the function I'm in and say, Emily, or email, Emily was called. Oh, and I have to put this in quotes. So now I'm going to say continue code, and now it kind of changed to a diamond, because it means it's going to write out and continue. So I'm going to close that and just throw another breakpoint here so we can see that Emily was written out. So we got that first breakpoint. Now you notice the second breakpoint skipped and we came right here. So if I go and look at my output window, which I accidentally closed, let's go back up here to build, view output. I should see here program.main string. So that was the function Emily was called. So you can write out virtually anything you want. And you can use variables from the method. So I could have wrote out person.firstname was called if I chose to. Let's say I wanted to see more data. So I'm going to take that out, and you know what? I'm kind of tired of stopping and restarting the program. If you notice here, there is a, come on, I zoomed out too far and now my mouse won't move over. I'm kind of in a virtual screen right now, so it doesn't. Now you notice that there is an arrow, and if you look at my mouse pointer, I can drag and drop that arrow. So I'm going to drag it and drop it upwards. So I'm going to put it back on line 6. That's going to say, hey, redo or go back to here and redo everything you did. Keep in mind when you're doing this, it's going to re-execute the code. So if I go, let me zoom back out again. I go back and do step over, it's going to go and repopulate the people. That's a good thing and a bad thing, because if I'm doing something with a database or making a call out to a database or saving records, it's going to go and resave those records. So keep that in mind when you're doing it. You can also run to a point. So let's say I was back here and I wanted to run the code right to here. So there's this little green guy there that says run execution to here. So I can click on that and it's going to execute all the code right up into that point. So if we look at our console app, you notice I said it reruns the code. So it already went through the first 4 iterations of people and reran the next 4 again. Oops. So now I'm here. I still haven't found the bug, so maybe I'm going to go back to here. Now I can right click and choose run to here or set next statement. And then I think I figured it out, but I run to here. If I put a breakpoint here, it's going to continue and stop there at the first person. But let's say I want to skip all that, but keep that breakpoint. You have two different options. You can disable the breakpoint here, and the breakpoint is temporarily disabled. Or what I like to do, I'm going to enable the breakpoint. There is a force run to cursor, which is going to just skip that breakpoint. So if I do that, it's going to skip over those breakpoints and rewrite out all those. As you can see, Joseph, Deirdre, Joseph, and Emily were written. So that's all cool. There's also a debugging menu that you can get to, which I said we were going to talk about, are breakpoints. If you look at the breakpoint windows, you can see all the breakpoints that are in my application. So I have a breakpoint here on line 3, character 1, line 3, character 1, and then line 3, character 9. So this is apparently 9 spaces out. I can create new one if you're hardcore. You can create one. You'd have to name the function. So I'd have to do program.cs, and then I think it's main, something like that. I'm not that good to remember where it is. You can also temporarily disable them from here. As you see now, if you look here, they're disabled on the screen. I'm going to re-enable them. There's a delete all, disable all from here. This is a cool feature. So let's say it's 4:55 p.m. on a Friday. You're about to go on vacation, and your boss or leader's admin calls and says, "Hey, Joe, I got a problem with the weekly TPS report. I need you to figure it out." And you're like, "I'm out. I'm on vacation." But you've been debugging the problem for a while. You can export these breakpoints. If I click here, I'll get prompted with the dialog box to an XML file that then Mahesh can go and learn, because Mahesh loves to work late and on the weekends. He can then import that into his Visual Studio and see all that. So that's kind of a cool feature. Another cool feature is, like, let's say you have those breakpoints going and you can't reproduce it on your machine, so you have to go to your boss's administrative assistant's machine. But you don't want to have to install 2 gigs of Visual Studio or 17,000 floppy disk if you're old school like me. There is a way you can attach to the machine. So if you go to debug, actually you have to stop it first. So let me stop. And then I can go to debug, and then there's attached to process here. So this is kind of what happens behind the scenes. It's actually attaching their process when I hit the play button. But here I can debug any machine. So here I'm running Microsoft Edge on this machine, and StreamYard. If I was a glutton for punishment, I can connect to that instance of Microsoft Edge and try to debug the code or reverse engineer the code. But here there's a connection target, and this is going to look weird because I am running in a virtual machine. If I was to click on Find and allow the Windows Defender, it's not going to show me any things, but I can do, let's say, admin machine, and then I can see all the processes running on his or her machine. It would look like this, and then I can say, oh, well, the RDP clip is the broken one, so let me attach that. So that's a very cool feature. You have to have a port open. It's like 5 something or 443 for it to work, and it works in most scenarios. So that's cool. You notice a lot when I was talking about debugging, I mentioned the person and stuff. So let's take a look at some of the other tips you can use. So I no longer want a breakpoint there, so I'm going to remove that. We're in the person. Let's take a look at the people. So if I hover over people, do it again. If I hover over people, you see this little data tip thing. It says people, there's a view, count of 4. Because this is a list, it's going to show me the count. I can click on the view, and it says I'm using the Xml Visualizer. Before I showed you there was a text visualizer, an HTML, a JSON, and an XML one. This is using the Xml, which by default shows just the count. I can hover over it and see that it's a list or an Xml that has 4 elements of it. These elements are of type mastering, debugging. I can go and click on any one of them and see details about it. So this has a child count of 1, date of birth of 5/31/1971, email address, and so on. I can also go and change these right here. So I can double click on this element and change it to Joe, because no one really calls me Joseph. So when I change it to Joe and hit enter, it updates there. And you'll notice the full name property also changed, because the full name property is based on first name, middle initial, and last name. So that changed. One thing to note about that is that it doesn't change a database. This is only changing the variable in memory. So if it goes back and let's say on line 12 in my code or in line 11, I'm saving to a database. It will then go and write Joe as the first name. You can also hopefully see, I'll have to zoom in for this one. There's a little pin icon next to each variable. So I'm going to pin this. And now I'm creating what's called a data tip. So this data tip will share the text. So right now it's showing a new collection debug view, and it's Joseph Guadagno. So now as I navigate each person, so if I shift 10 or F10 over it, it's going to go and change it. So now as I execute, hey, what happened? I was supposed to change it to me. Why didn't it change it? Oh, probably because I did it off of the people and not the person. Let me go and fix that. Let's go and unpin you and go here to the person, full name, and pin that. So now as I go through and run this, you'll notice it's grayed out now because it knows that the variable is going to change and it's no longer in scope. I click that, it goes red because it says, hey, this variable is about to change. And then it changed. So now it's red to show me it's changed. So that's cool. I also have access to these variables in something called the locals window. So the locals window will be, it tries to be smart enough and determine all the variables that in scope. So based on line 10, it says, I have access to arguments, because again, this is a submain in C#10. So there's the arguments variable as a parameter. I have access to the people, so 4, and I have access to a variable called person. So I can go and do the same thing I could in that other window and change this to JJ, because everyone calls him JJ. And you notice it changed everywhere else. So it changed here, went red, this went red because it changed. So that's kind of cool. I could also add an item to watch. Let's say I wanted to watch what this person's full name was. So I can right click on it and choose add to watch, and it adds the full name. It says the person's not available for some reason because it never saw it. I think that's because there is no setter for it. So that's probably not a good property to add. Let's look at the person and do first name and add to watch. So now I always have the first person here. So I'll always see the first person. So if I was to drag this bad boy up here and restart it again, no, I'm hitting step into, which in a list method does a lot of weird things. You don't want to do that. So step over, you notice I have the person full name here. That's going to change. I have the person first name here. That's going to change. Now they all changed everywhere. Went to Joseph for the first name. Full name was changed. And now I'm going to go to the next one. It's going to change. So it's kind of cool. There's also other watch windows you can add. Where are we? Debug windows. There's an immediate window also, which I can change. The immediate window lets you execute most .NET language calls from here. Think of it like a command line for your code. So I can do person first name, and it shows me the person's first name. I can do person.first name equals B, because that's what everyone calls her, and it goes and updates it, and the same thing holds true. Actually, let's pin this way. Updated here and updated here. So you can do just about anything. The only thing you really can't do here is lambda expressions. So I can't do like person to person dot whatever. They don't generally work. I can do basic math. 5 divided by 2. So that's cool. What else can you do from here? I showed all that. I'm not going to cover the memory modules. One of the other things that you may have noticed, as you hover over people, you get a count of 4. When you look at a person item, you get a mastering debugging. That's kind of useless if you're debugging, because now I have to click on here and see things. There's these little wrenches that you can click on, which basically give you the editability. But I want to see more data. So there's a hidden feature, and I say hidden because not a lot of people know about it, called the Debugger display attributes. So I'm going to stop the app for a minute, and we're going to go back to our person class. And then look at this hidden for now. So I'm going to add something called system.diagnostic.debugger display. And what this does is says, hey, anytime the debugger wants to see this class, anytime the debugger wants to display something from this class, display this instead. So you get the full string interpolation to it. So I can put in any property that I have access to here. So right now I'm displaying the full name, and you get IntelliSense. So I can do open parentheses, first name, and I should have IntelliSense, but it's not working. Right now I'm doing date of birth dot minute, number of children equals children dot count. So when I run myself, it should say Joseph J. Guadagno, 17th minute, and number of children 1. Let's save that. Because if I look here, when I'm initializing myself, it's Joseph J. Guadagno, and then the children. But if you notice here, for some reason, my wife doesn't have any kids, which I have to talk to her about because we have 2 of them. And my son and daughter don't have any kids, which is right. But if I run this, this is going to cause an error because that list is null. So let's see what happens when that happens. I'm going to put a breakpoint here after the first person. So let's hit run. So if I go and look at the people and click on it, now I see more information. I see Joseph J. Guadagno, 17, number of children 1, and then the number of children for my wife's son and daughter are object reference not set to an instance of an object. So an exception was raised, but it didn't break the application. It just brought me back to it to show that. So that's kind of cool. That's a way that you can add debugging information to your code and can be publicly available. One last thing I wanted to show. So you notice we have these pin things. I can actually add stuff to it. This is the person's full name. Or in the example of that TPS report that was failing, this is the problem data. And then I can actually view all those. So where is it? There's a data tips window somewhere. Oh, here it is. I can export all the data tips. So that same thing when I was done, just like I could export breakpoints, I can export my data tips so Mahesh can go and handle all that, can handle that problem for me. I don't have to worry about it. And with 2 minutes to spare, I am done, and we can pull up the slides for any questions and or my info.